To find a plane forgotten for 40 years, veteran Robert Holding must journey to a remote waterfall deep in the wilderness. But as the roar of the water grows louder, his only companion, the dog Buddy, becomes agitated, trying to pull him from the path. The dog saved his life. Lying in the middle of the trail was a steel bear trap, set not to catch beasts, but to guard a deadly secret. Robert now knows that the keeper of the waterfall's secret is still lurking in the shadows, and he is not a welcome visitor. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The silence in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains was a living thing. It was a dense, heavy blanket woven from the scent of pine and damp earth, punctuated only by the whisper of wind through the Douglas firs and the distant cry of a hawk. For Robert Holding, this silence was both a sanctuary and a prison. His small, weathered cabin, nestled on the edge of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington, was the only fortress he had against a world that had become too loud, too fast, too full of ghosts. Robert was a man carved from the same rugged landscape he inhabited. At 58, his tall frame was leaner than it had been in his youth, but the broad shoulders and steady hands still spoke of a deep, resilient strength. His short brown hair was streaked with silver at the temples, a testament to years he preferred not to count. A neatly trimmed but dense beard covered a rugged face, etched with lines that told stories of both hardship and a kindness he rarely showed to anyone but his dog. Dressed in his usual uniform of a faded plaid shirt in navy and gray, worn open over a gray t-shirt, worn blue jeans, and sturdy work boots, he looked every bit a part of the wilderness that surrounded him. His only companion in this self-imposed exile was Buddy, an 8-year-old German shepherd. Buddy was a magnificent animal, his thick coat a striking blend of gray and white, his intelligent amber eyes missing nothing. A retired search and rescue dog, he moved with the quiet confidence of a seasoned professional, his loyalty to Robert absolute and unquestioning. He was more than a pet. He was an anchor, the one steady presence that kept Robert from drifting completely into the stormy waters of his memory. The mornings were the worst. That was when the dreams came, fragments of screaming wind, blinding snow, and a face, young and terrified, that would forever be etched behind his eyes. He would wake with a jolt, his heart hammering against his ribs, the cold sweat of the nightmare clinging to him. On this particular morning, the phantom cold was so real he could feel it in his bones. He sat up, gasping for the crisp mountain air, his gaze darting around the familiar, Spartan interior of the cabin. But the ghosts followed him from sleep. He felt a wet nose press insistently into his palm. Buddy had moved from his spot at the foot of the bed and now stood beside him, his head resting on Robert's knee, his tail giving a slow, reassuring thump against the wooden floor. Robert's hand automatically went to the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur of his ruff. He focused on the solid, warm presence of the dog, the rhythmic beat of his tail, the calm, steady gaze. Slowly, the frantic rhythm of his own heart began to slow, the icy grip of the past loosening its hold. Buddy was his only medicine, his only peace. Later that day, driven by a restless energy he couldn't quell, Robert decided to tackle the one place he had been avoiding for years, the old storage shed that had belonged to his father. The shed was a time capsule, filled with the remnants of a life lived with a passion Robert often felt he lacked. His father had been a nature photographer, a man who found his church in the grand cathedrals of the forest. He had passed away a decade ago, leaving Robert the cabin and everything in it. The air inside the shed was thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and turpentine. Sunlight streamed through a single grimy window, illuminating dancing dust motes. Robert started sorting through old tools and fishing gear, a mindless task to occupy his hands. Buddy, however, seemed to have his own mission. He bypassed the interesting smells of dried bait and motor oil, heading directly to a cluttered corner in the back. He began sniffing intently at a stack of old canvases, his tail held low and stiff. A low whine escaped his throat. "What is it, boy?" Robert asked, his voice raspy from disuse. Buddy ignored him, nudging one of the canvases with his nose, then looking back at Robert with an unusual intensity. He whined again, louder this time. Trusting the dog's instincts had been drilled into Robert during his years in Air Force pararescue. Buddy never fussed over nothing. Robert moved the canvases aside, revealing a heavy dark green metal box. It was a professional photographer's field case, built to withstand the elements, with heavy-duty latches and a rubber seal visible around the lid. He didn't remember ever seeing it before. Wiping away a thick layer of dust, he worked the stiff latches, which opened with a satisfying clank. He lifted the lid. The hiss of air breaking the seal was audible in the quiet shed. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam padding, was his father's old 35mm film camera. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, all silver and black metal, looking as pristine as the day it was made. Next to it were several small, white packets of silica gel, now hard as pebbles, their job of absorbing moisture done long ago. Robert lifted the camera, its weight familiar and comforting in his hands. He ran a thumb over the cool metal, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. On a whim, he checked the film compartment. He expected it to be empty, but it wasn't. A roll of film was still loaded inside. The counter stopped at 24 exposures. Curiosity, an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time, sparked within him. What was on this roll? Why had his father never developed it? 100 questions bloomed in the silence of the shed. He knew that processing film this old was a long shot, but the thought of seeing those final, forgotten images, one last message from his father, took root. The decision felt momentous. It meant leaving his sanctuary. It meant driving into town, dealing with people, with noise, with the world he had worked so hard to shut out. He looked down at Buddy, who sat patiently at his feet, watching him, his amber eyes seeming to understand the weight of the moment. "Well, boy," Robert said softly, the words feeling strange on his tongue, "looks like we're going on a trip." The drive into town was an assault on the senses. After years cocooned in the deep quiet of the forest, the rumble of his old pickup truck's engine felt like a roar, the passing cars on the highway a blur of hostile metal. Robert kept his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, a calm, steady presence. He seemed to sense his owner's unease, occasionally resting his chin on Robert's thigh, his amber eyes offering silent support. Each mile away from the cabin felt like a mile into enemy territory. He found what he was looking for in a small, quiet strip mall on the outskirts of town. A tiny shop with a faded sign that read, "Evergreen Photo Lab." It looked like a relic from another era, much like the roll of film tucked safely in his shirt pocket. The man behind the counter was named Leo, a small, cheerful individual in his late 60s with a fringe of white hair around a bald head and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He wore a simple, clean apron over a plaid shirt and greeted Robert with a warm, professional smile. Robert placed the film canister on the counter. "I was hoping you could develop this for me," he said, the words feeling clumsy. "It's old, very old." Leo picked it up, examining it with a practiced eye. "Well now, you're not kidding," he chuckled, turning the canister over. "This has been out of production for a long time. Where did you find it?" "In my father's old camera case," Robert explained, offering no further detail. "I can try, but I make no promises," Leo said kindly. "Film this old, especially if it wasn't stored properly, can be a total loss. The emulsion might be degraded. It could come out blank, or just a mess of colors." "I understand. Just do what you can," Robert replied. The possibility of failure was a sharp pang of disappointment, but he had to know. "Come back in a couple of days," Leo said, scribbling a claim ticket, "and we'll see if your father left you any magic." The 2 days of waiting were a special kind of torment. The trip had stirred up the hornet's nest of his anxiety, and back at the cabin, the silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt empty, charged with anticipation. He and Buddy took long, aimless hikes through the forest. The physical exertion, a welcome distraction. but his mind kept returning to the little canister in Leo's shop. When he returned, the bell above the door chimed, and Leo looked up from his work, a wide, genuine smile spreading across his face. "Mr. Holding, I was hoping you'd be in today," he said, his voice full of excitement. He reached under the counter and produced a thick, glossy envelope of photos. "I honestly can't believe it. The film was almost perfectly preserved. That metal case must have been airtight. You were really lucky." Robert's heart gave a hopeful leap. He took the envelope, his calloused fingers fumbling slightly with the flap. "Thank you," he managed, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He didn't look at them in the shop. These were private, a final conversation with his father that he needed to have alone. He walked back to his truck, Buddy whining softly in the passenger seat, sensing the tension. Instead of starting the engine, Robert tore open the envelope. He slid the stack of photographs out. The first 20 or so were breathtaking. They were his father's work, unmistakably. A sunbeam piercing the dense canopy of an old-growth forest. The intricate pattern of frost on a fern leaf. A majestic elk, antlers crowned with morning mist, staring directly into the lens. Each photo was a testament to his father's patience and his deep love for the wilderness. Robert felt a familiar ache in his chest, a mix of pride and sorrow. Then, he got to the last 3. The mood shifted instantly. The first of the 3 was a jarring, chaotic image. It was a close-up of a twisted piece of metal, a 3-bladed propeller bent into an unnatural shape against a backdrop of dark, wet rock. He slid it to the back, his breath catching in his throat. The next photo was clearer, more damning. It showed the tail section of a small, single-engine airplane, a Cessna, wedged violently into a rocky ravine. It was covered in moss and vines, but the registration numbers on the rudder were still faintly visible through the grime of decades. The final photograph was taken from further away. It showed the full, tragic scene. The bulk of the fuselage was hidden, tucked away behind the shimmering curtain of a tall, slender waterfall that cascaded down a sheer cliff face. The mist from the falls shrouded the wreckage, making it look ghostly, ethereal. It was a tomb, sealed by water and time. Back at the cabin, the quiet was no longer empty. It was filled with the silent screams of the past. Robert sat at his small wooden desk, the 3 photographs laid out before him like evidence in a cold case. He powered up his old laptop, the satellite internet connection slow and laborious. His fingers, once so adept at handling rescue equipment, now felt clumsy on the keyboard. He typed the registration number from the plane's tail into the Federal Aviation Administration's database. No results found. He tried the National Transportation Safety Board's accident database, running a search for any reported crashes in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest from the 1970s and 80s. Page after page of reports, but none matched the plane, the location, or the circumstances. It was as if the plane had simply vanished from the sky, leaving no official trace, no grieving families, no search parties. It had been swallowed by the wilderness, its final moments captured only by the silent, accidental witness of his father's camera. Robert leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating his haunted face. The old instincts, the ones he had tried to bury for a decade, began to stir. The training, the discipline, the deeply ingrained sense of duty. A life had been lost out there. A story had been left unfinished. He looked at the photo of the waterfall, at the secret it held. He felt a profound, undeniable debt to the nameless soul in that wreckage. This wasn't just about a lost plane. It was about a mission that had never been completed. It was a chance to finally bring someone home. The discovery of the photographs had flipped a switch within Robert Holding. The fog of aimless days, once thick and suffocating, had burned away, replaced by the clear, sharp focus of a man with a mission. The ghosts of the past were still there, but now they stood at his back, pushing him forward instead of holding him down. For the first time in a decade, he was no longer just surviving. He was preparing. The floor of his small cabin became his command center. He unrolled a series of topographical maps of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, their surfaces a complex web of contour lines, rivers, and trails. He weighed down the corners with books and mugs, creating a mosaic of the wilderness that separated him from his objective. The 3 photographs lay in the center, a stark and constant reminder of his purpose. His finger, calloused and sure, traced the faint blue lines of rivers and the tight clusters of brown that signified steep terrain. He studied his father's wide-angle shot of the waterfall, comparing the unique curvature of the cliff face and the surrounding ridges to the patterns on the map. He triangulated the position based on the visible peaks in the background, his mind a practiced calculator of distance and elevation. After hours of intense concentration, he circled a small, remote area, deep in a valley that was largely untouched by marked trails. On an older, more detailed map from his father's collection, the area was marked with a faint, hand-penciled note: Silent Falls. The name sent a shiver down his spine. It was the place. With the destination locked in, the second phase began, the ritual of preparation. He went to a large wooden footlocker at the end of his bed, a container he hadn't opened since he'd left the service. The hinges groaned in protest as he lifted the lid. Inside, the tools of his former life lay dormant, each piece a vessel of powerful memories. He laid everything out on the floor with meticulous precision. A 150-foot length of climbing rope, its nylon sheath still in perfect condition. He ran its length through his hands, the familiar texture a comfort. He checked his harness, the metal buckles, the webbing. Next came the hardware, a collection of carabiners, ascenders, and descenders, each one clicking softly as he inspected it for any signs of wear. They were like old friends. He assembled his full trauma kit and then turned his attention to a long, cloth-wrapped object at the bottom of the locker. He carefully unwrapped it, revealing his 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. It was a simple, reliable firearm, its wooden stock worn smooth from use. For Robert, this was not a weapon of aggression. It was a tool of survival, an essential piece of equipment for anyone venturing deep into a wilderness populated by bears and mountain lions. It was a fundamental rule of safety he had never broken. He methodically disassembled it, cleaning each part with practiced efficiency before reassembling it with a series of satisfying, solid clicks. Buddy watched the entire process with an almost unnerving stillness. He lay on his worn blanket by the cold fireplace, his head resting on his paws, but his amber eyes followed Robert's every move. He could sense the change in his master. The heavy cloak of melancholy that usually enveloped Robert had been replaced by an electric current of focused energy. This was the man Buddy had known on missions, the calm, confident leader he was trained to follow. When Robert pulled a specially designed canine harness from the footlocker, Buddy's tail gave a single, solid thump against the floor. He stood up, stretched, and walked over, nudging the harness with his nose as if to say, "I'm ready when you are." Robert paused, looking down at his loyal companion. He knelt and cupped the dog's powerful head in his hands, pressing his forehead against Buddy's. "I can't do this without you, boy," he whispered. Buddy responded with a soft lick on his bearded cheek. The final preparations were for sustenance and survival. A high-calorie food supply for both man and dog, a water purification system, a compass, fire starters, an emergency beacon. He packed it all into his old military-grade rucksack, each item placed for optimal weight distribution and accessibility. The shotgun was secured to the side of the pack, easily accessible, but out of the way. The pack was heavy, but it was a familiar weight, a burden he was glad to carry once more. He spent the evening sitting by the window, watching the last light of day bleed from the sky, the packed rucksack standing by the door like a silent sentinel. He didn't feel the familiar dread of the approaching night. Tonight, his mind was clear, occupied not with what was lost, but with what needed to be found. The next morning, he was up before the Sunday. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the promise of a clear day. He moved with a quiet efficiency, making a final check of his gear, filling his canteen, and putting a fresh bowl of food down for Buddy. He dressed not in his usual worn jeans, but in durable cargo pants and his sturdiest pair of hiking boots. As the first rays of sunlight speared through the tall firs, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, Robert shouldered his pack. He took one last look around the small space that had been his refuge for so long. Then he turned to the door. He opened it, and the vast, silent wilderness greeted him. He took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. Buddy was already outside, standing at the head of the overgrown path, looking back at him, ready. Robert gave a curt nod. It was time. Together, the old para-rescueman and his faithful dog stepped out of the shadows of the past and into the light of their final mission. The wilderness did not yield its secrets easily. The first 2 days of the journey were a grueling testament to that fact. The overgrown path Robert had followed from his cabin quickly dissolved into a trackless expanse of dense forest. They were forced to navigate by compass and the sun, pushing through thickets of thorny salmonberry bushes and over the slick, moss-covered corpses of fallen giants. For Robert, it was a return to a familiar dance. His body, despite the decade of disuse, remembered the rhythm of the wild. He moved with a practiced economy, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the language of the land. He knew how to place his feet to avoid a twisted ankle on the uneven ground, how to gauge the stability of a rock before putting his full weight on it. His skills were a part of him, etched into his very being. But his body was no longer the finely tuned instrument it had once been. He was 58, not 28. A dull ache settled deep in his lower back by the end of the first day, and his knees protested with every steep descent. He pushed the pain down, treating it as just another obstacle to be overcome. But it was a constant, humbling reminder of the years that had been stolen from him, not by age, but by inertia. In this struggle, Buddy was more than a companion. He was an essential partner. The German shepherd moved through the undergrowth with a fluid grace that Robert envied. When they came to a seemingly impassable wall of vegetation, Buddy would unerringly find the weakest point, a barely visible game trail that would save them an hour of hacking through the brush. He located a small, clear spring bubbling from a rock face when their canteens were running low, his keen ears picking up the faint sound of running water long before Robert could. On the afternoon of the third day, Buddy's value shifted from guide to guardian. They were traversing a steep, rocky slope when the dog suddenly froze mid-stride. He stood rigid, his head low, a deep, almost inaudible growl vibrating in his chest. The fur along his spine bristled. Robert stopped instantly, his hand dropping not to the shotgun on his pack, but to the handle of the large knife on his belt. It was a quieter, more immediate defense. He followed Buddy's fixed gaze up the slope. For a moment, he saw nothing but rock and shadow. Then, a flicker of movement. On a wide ledge about 50 feet above them, a mountain lion lay stretched out, its tawny coat blending almost perfectly with the dry stone. It was a large male, its long tail twitching almost lazily as it watched them. It was not hunting, merely observing, a silent king surveying its domain. Robert's heart hammered in his chest, but his training took over. He made no sudden moves. The shotgun felt heavy on his shoulder, a powerful but loud solution to a problem that didn't yet exist. A single gunshot would echo for miles through these canyons. In a forest that already felt strangely silent and marked by unsettling signs, revealing their exact position was a tactical mistake he was unwilling to make. He chose the quiet way. He stood his ground, making himself look as large as possible without being aggressive. "Easy, boy," he murmured to Buddy, his voice low and calm. The standoff was absolute, a moment of primal communication. Buddy did not bark or lunge. He simply held his position, a gray and white statue of unwavering courage, a clear message that he would defend his human to the death. After a long, tense minute that felt like an eternity, the mountain lion seemed to make a decision. It gave a dismissive flick of its tail, rose with a fluid, powerful grace, and melted back into the shadows of the rocks, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. Robert let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Adrenaline coursed through him, leaving him shaky. He knelt and buried his face in Buddy's thick ruff. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "What would I do without you?" That night, the adrenaline gave way to a crushing exhaustion. They made camp in a small clearing, and Robert built a small, controlled fire, more for comfort than for warmth. As he sat staring into the dancing flames, the stress of the past few days began to take its toll. The crackle of the fire began to sound like the hiss of wind-driven snow. The deep shadows of the forest began to feel like the suffocating whiteout of a blizzard. He was no longer in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. He was on the unforgiving slopes of Mount Rainier, years ago, the wind screaming in his ears. He could see the young climber's face, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror, as Robert tried to secure him to the rescue line. He could feel the sudden, sickening lurch as a gust of wind tore the boy from the cliffside, his desperate shout swallowed by the storm. Robert began to hyperventilate, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead despite the warmth of the fire. The world around him was dissolving, replaced by the blinding white hell of his greatest failure. He felt a sudden heavy pressure on his legs. A wet nose pushed hard against his cheek. Buddy had moved from his spot and had laid his entire body across Robert's lap, pinning him with his reassuring weight. The dog whined, a sound of deep concern, and licked at the tears Robert hadn't realized were streaming down his face. The solid, warm reality of the dog was an anchor in the swirling chaos of his mind. Robert's hands, which had been clenched into useless fists, found their way into Buddy's fur. He gripped the thick coat, his knuckles white. He focused on the feeling of the dog's steady breathing, the rhythmic thump of his tail against the ground, the unwavering loyalty in his eyes. Slowly, painfully, the screaming wind in his head began to recede. The image of the falling climber faded, replaced by the gentle, concerned face of his dog. He sat there for a long time, his arms wrapped around Buddy, the old rescuer being saved by his own partner. The panic subsided, leaving behind a familiar, hollow ache. The trail to Silent Falls was cold and hard, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the trail through his own past was the most dangerous one of all. The morning after Robert's panic attack dawned crisp and unforgiving. The hollow ache of his trauma remained, but the sharp edges had been smoothed away by a night of deep, restorative sleep with Buddy pressed against his side. The mission, his singular focus, pulled him forward. They broke camp in silence and continued their trek, Robert feeling a renewed, if fragile, sense of determination. By midday, a new sound began to permeate the forest. A low, persistent roar that grew steadily louder, vibrating through the soles of Robert's boots. It was the sound of powerful water. According to his father's old map, they were approaching the Cispus River, which they needed to cross to continue towards the valley of the Silent Falls. The map showed a small seasonal wooden bridge used by rangers and hunters. When they finally broke through the tree line and stood on the bank, Robert's heart sank. The river was not the calm, crossable stream he had anticipated. It was a raging, brown torrent, swollen and violent with the meltwater from the high-altitude snowfields. The water churned and boiled, carrying entire logs and pieces of debris downstream with terrifying speed. And, where the bridge should have been, there was nothing but two splintered pylons, a testament to the river's overwhelming power. Their path was blocked. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over Robert. The thought of turning back, of failing before he had even reached his objective, was a bitter pill. He looked at the furious water, and for a second, it felt like a physical manifestation of the chaos in his own mind. He felt a nudge at his hand. Buddy stood beside him, looking not at the river, but up at him, his gaze steady and unquestioning. The dog's complete faith was a silent rebuke to his own momentary doubt. Robert took a deep breath, pushing the despair away. He was a pararescueman. An obstacle was not an ending. It was a problem to be solved. His eyes scanned the opposite bank, 50 feet of churning chaos away. He spotted what he was looking for: a massive, old-growth cedar tree with a thick, sturdy trunk that stood just a few yards from the water's edge. It was the perfect anchor. The ritual began again. He shrugged off his heavy pack and uncoiled his rope. He pulled a small, powerful crossbow from a side pocket of his pack, a tool used for launching pilot lines across ravines. He attached a lightweight but strong Kevlar line to a blunt-tipped bolt and tied the other end to his main climbing rope. He took aim, compensating for the wind. The crossbow fired with a sharp thwack, and the bolt flew true, trailing the thin line behind it. It struck the cedar tree with a solid thud, embedding itself deep in the bark. A small victory. He spent the next hour painstakingly pulling the heavy climbing rope across the river, the current fighting him every inch of the way, threatening to drag it downstream. His muscles burned with the effort, sweat stinging his eyes. Finally, the rope was across. He secured his end to the base of an equally sturdy fir tree, pulling the line as taut as a guitar string. He had created a Tyrolean traverse, a rope bridge spanning the furious water. The gear was the easy part. He clipped his rucksack and their supplies to the rope with a carabiner and a pulley, and sent them sliding across to the other side. Now came the true test. He knelt in front of Buddy, showing him the special canine harness. "Okay, boy," he said, his voice calm and even, masking the anxiety churning in his gut. "This is it. You have to trust me. You have to trust me completely." Buddy whined softly, his eyes fixed on the terrifying river. He was a rescue dog, not an aquatic specialist. He could swim, but this was different. This was a monster. Robert clipped the harness around Buddy's body, making sure it was snug but not restrictive. He attached a leash to the harness, then clipped the leash's handle to the main rope with another pulley. He would guide him across, hand over hand. He waded into the icy water up to his knees, the current immediately trying to rip his legs out from under him. He held onto the rope, his knuckles white. "Come on, Buddy, with me!" Hesitantly, Buddy followed him in. The moment the cold water hit his chest, the dog flinched, but he kept his eyes locked on Robert. Robert began to pull them across, his arms straining, the rope digging into his palms. The river fought them with a malevolent force. The roar was deafening, the spray cold as ice. They were halfway across when a large, submerged log slammed into Robert's legs, knocking him off his feet. He went under, the icy water a shocking, brutal blow that stole his breath. He held onto the rope with a death grip, his head breaking the surface a moment later, sputtering and gasping. The current was trying to pull Buddy under as well, the dog paddling frantically, his eyes wide with fear. For a terrifying second, the image of the falling climber flashed in Robert's mind. Failure. But he shook his head, rage and determination surging through him. Not again, not this time. "I've got you, Buddy!" he roared over the din of the river. "I've got you!" With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he found his footing and pulled. He put his back into it, his muscles screaming in protest, his mind focused on one single thought: get his partner to safety. Foot by painful foot, they fought their way through the current. Finally, his boots scraped against gravel. They had reached the other side. He collapsed on the riverbank, pulling Buddy onto the shore with him. They lay there for several minutes, gasping for breath, soaked and shivering. Robert unclipped the harness from the dog and wrapped his arms around him, burying his face in his wet fur. Buddy licked his face, his tail starting to thump weakly against the ground. They had made it. It had cost them dearly in energy, but the victory was profound. As Robert looked back at the raging river they had just conquered, he felt a flicker of the old confidence return. The mission was hard, the wilderness was unforgiving, but he and his partner, together, were stronger. It took the rest of the day for Robert and Buddy to recover from their ordeal at the river. They found a sheltered spot beneath a rock outcropping where Robert built a large, roaring fire. They huddled close to its warmth, slowly drying their clothes and fur, the heat a welcome comfort against the deep chill that had settled in their bones. The crossing had been a brutal, physically demanding trial, but as Robert shared a portion of his rations with Buddy, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had faced the river's fury and won. They set off the next morning with renewed purpose, venturing into the final leg of their journey. The terrain here was different, the forest older and darker. The trees were ancient titans, their massive canopies interlocking high above, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. And with the change in landscape came a change in atmosphere. The cheerful chatter of birds and squirrels that had accompanied them for days began to fade. The rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth ceased. A deep, unnatural quiet descended, a silence that felt heavy and watchful. It was not the peaceful silence of his cabin, but a tense, expectant hush, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Robert found himself treading more softly, his senses on high alert. It was Buddy who first noticed the marks. The dog stopped, his nose twitching, and let out a low, questioning whine. Robert followed his gaze to a large hemlock tree. Carved into its bark, about head-high, was a strange symbol, a simple circle with a vertical line running through it. It was old, the edges of the cut gray and weathered, but it was unmistakably man-made. It wasn't an official trail blaze from the Forest Service. A few hundred yards later, they found another one, this time on a flat-faced boulder, and then another on a fallen log. They were not marking a clear path, but seemed to form a loose, irregular perimeter. They felt less like guides and more like warnings, territorial markers. As the day wore on, the unsettling silence deepened, and Buddy's demeanor changed. He began to walk with his head low, his body tense, his tail held straight and stiff. He stayed so close to Robert's leg that his fur brushed against his pants with every step. He was on edge, his usual calm confidence replaced by a nervous energy that communicated itself clearly to Robert. They came to a fork in a faint game trail. One path led down into a gully, a seemingly more direct route. The other curved up and around a steep, rocky hill. Robert, consulting his compass, saw that the gully was the logical choice. It would save them at least an hour. He took a step in that direction, but was stopped short. Buddy had planted his feet, refusing to move. He let out a sharp, insistent bark, then actively pushed against Robert's legs with his body, trying to herd him towards the higher path. "What is it, boy?" Robert asked softly, resting a hand on the dog's tense shoulders. "The way is down there." Buddy barked again, a sound of pure agitation. He looked down the gully path, and the fur on his neck bristled. He then looked up at the high trail, then back at Robert, whining with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. Robert's training had taught him one invaluable lesson: always trust your dog. A trained dog's senses could perceive threats a human would completely miss. He had seen it time and time again in the field. Ignoring Buddy's warning was not an option. "Okay," Robert conceded, his own sense of unease growing. "Okay, we go your way." The high path was harder, a grueling climb over loose rock and tangled roots that left Robert's legs burning and his lungs gasping for air. It took them nearly 2 hours to navigate the treacherous detour. When they finally descended back to the forest floor, they rejoined the game trail a quarter of a mile past the gully. Curiosity gnawed at Robert. He had to know what had spooked his partner so badly. Leaving Buddy with a firm stay command, he unslung his pack and quietly backtracked towards the gully entrance he had bypassed. He moved with the practiced stealth of a soldier, his boots making almost no sound on the pine needle-covered ground. As he approached the spot where the trail had forked, he saw it. Right in the middle of the narrow path, half hidden by ferns, was a bear trap. It was a monstrous thing, a set of rusted steel jaws the size of a dinner plate, held open by a powerful spring mechanism. But it was the state of the trap that made his blood run cold. It had been sprung. The jaws were slammed shut, their cruel teeth biting into a thick branch that had fallen on the pressure plate. It had been there for a long time, the metal dark with age, the surrounding earth undisturbed. He stared at it, his mind racing. This was no ordinary trapper's equipment. It was placed not on a run, but on a human trail. Its purpose was not to catch an animal, but to maim or kill whatever person was unlucky enough to step on it. A chilling realization settled over him. His decision not to fire the shotgun at the mountain lion had been the right one. A gunshot would have been a dinner bell, announcing his presence to whoever set this trap. The silence of the forest, the strange warning signs, Buddy's frantic behavior, it all clicked into place. They were not alone out here. Someone else lived in this remote corner of the wilderness. Someone who had been here for a very, very long time. Someone who did not want to be found. And someone who lived in a state of constant defensive paranoia, willing to use lethal force to protect their isolation. Robert backed away slowly, his hand resting on Buddy's head for reassurance when he returned. The mission had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. The discovery of the bear trap changed the very nature of their mission. The wilderness, which had been an impartial adversary of rock, river, and tooth, now held a new and more unsettling threat: man. Every shadow seemed deeper, every snapping twig underfoot a potential alert to a hostile presence. Robert moved with a renewed caution, his senses stretched taut, his every step a calculated risk. He was no longer just a rescuer on a mission. He was an intruder in someone else's fortified territory. He kept Buddy on a short leash, a decision that pained him but was necessary for stealth. They moved away from the game trails, sticking to the deeper woods, their progress slow and arduous. The constant vigilance was exhausting, a mental strain that was in some ways more taxing than the physical exertion. Robert found himself scanning the trees not for landmarks, but for signs of human habitation: a tripwire, another trap, the glint of a watchful eye. For hours, this tense, silent procession continued. The only sounds were their own muffled footsteps on the damp earth and the whisper of the wind high in the canopy. The unnatural quiet of the forest now felt like a suffocating blanket of paranoia. Yet, as the afternoon sun began to slant through the trees, a new sound began to assert itself, a sound they had been walking towards for days. It started as a low, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration felt more than heard. Gradually, it grew into a distant, steady roar, the sound of the falls. As the sound of rushing water grew, Buddy's demeanor began to shift once more. The nervous, defensive posture he had held since discovering the trap began to recede. His head lifted, his nose twitching, testing the air. He pulled slightly on the leash, his focus shifting from the immediate surroundings to a scent on the wind. He let out a low, excited whine. Robert paused, watching his partner. This was not the agitated whine of warning from the day before. This was the keen, focused sound of a search dog locking onto a target. Robert's heart began to beat faster, a surge of anticipation cutting through the fear. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do you smell?" Buddy pulled again, harder this time, his powerful body straining against the leash. His nose was pointed directly towards the growing roar of the waterfall. Robert made a decision. He unclipped the leash. The potential danger from the forest's unseen inhabitant was still real, but the mission came first. And right now, Buddy was on the scent. Freed from the restraint, Buddy took off, not at a run, but at a determined trot, his nose to the ground. He weaved through the trees with an unerring sense of direction, pausing every so often to look back, ensuring Robert was following. Robert pushed himself to keep up, his fatigue forgotten, his mind now zeroed in on the chase. He trusted Buddy's instincts implicitly. The dog wasn't tracking an animal. Robert knew the scents Buddy was trained to find, the scent of disturbed earth, of clothing, of human remains, and the faint, ghost-like scent of aviation fuel and oxidized metal, scents that would linger for decades, undetectable to a human, but a blazing signal to a dog like Buddy. They half ran, half stumbled through the dense undergrowth, the roar of the falls becoming a deafening, all-encompassing presence. Mist began to drift through the trees, cool and damp against Robert's skin, clinging to Buddy's gray and white coat. The ground grew steeper, descending sharply into a narrow, rocky canyon. Buddy led him to the edge of a precipice. Below them, through a screen of ferns and dripping moss, was the source of the roar, the Silent Falls. It was a magnificent, heartbreakingly beautiful sight. A ribbon of white water plunged over 300 feet from a sheer cliff face, crashing into a deep, emerald pool below, sending a perpetual cloud of mist into the air. The scene was almost identical to his father's photograph, a place locked in time, but there was no sign of a plane. Robert's heart sank with a wave of bitter disappointment. Had he been wrong? Had he dragged them all this way, through all this danger, for nothing? But Buddy was not discouraged. He barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that cut through the roar of the water. He scrambled down a steep, treacherous slope, his claws finding purchase where Robert's boots slipped. He led him not to the pool at the base of the falls, but along the canyon wall, pushing through a thick, thorny curtain of wild blackberry vines that hid the rock face. Robert followed, the thorns tearing at his shirt and scratching his arms. He pushed aside the last of the tangled vines, and then he froze. There it was, tucked into a deep recess in the cliff, partially shielded by an overhang and almost completely consumed by the forest, was the wreckage of the Cessna. It was tilted at a grotesque angle, its nose buried deep in the earth, one wing sheared off and lying a dozen yards away. The fuselage was crumpled, its once white paint now a mottled camouflage of green moss, brown rust, and gray lichen. It was not a machine anymore. It was a monument to a forgotten tragedy, a metal tomb, sealed by 40 years of silence and neglect. Robert stood motionless, the roar of the waterfall filling his ears, the cool mist on his face. He felt no triumph, no thrill of discovery, only a profound and overwhelming sadness. He reached down and rested his hand on Buddy's head, his fingers sinking into the dog's damp fur. "You found it, boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You found it." The roar of the waterfall was a constant, powerful requiem for the silent tomb before them. Robert stood for a long moment, simply bearing witness, his hand never leaving Buddy's head. He was no stranger to death or disaster, but the profound isolation of this place, the sheer length of time this secret had been kept, imbued the scene with a heavy, almost sacred stillness. This was hallowed ground. With a deep breath, he shifted back into the mindset of his training. There was a protocol for this, a way to approach a scene with respect, but also with purpose. He gave Buddy a quiet command to stay, and the dog sat, a stoic, gray and white sentinel, watching over the wreckage. Robert approached the cockpit cautiously, his boots crunching on rusted metal and shattered glass. The plexiglass of the windscreen was long gone, leaving a gaping hole. He peered inside. The interior was a ruin, ravaged by 40 years of dampness and decay. Upholstery had rotted away, revealing the metal frame of the seats, and a fine layer of green moss coated almost every surface. And there, slumped in the pilot's seat, was what he had known he would find: the skeletal remains of the pilot, still partially held in place by the tattered remnants of a seatbelt. The sight was grim, but Robert felt no fear, only a deep, professional sorrow. He had seen this many times before. He offered a silent prayer for the soul who had met his end here, alone and forgotten. His mission was to change that. His trained eyes scanned the small cabin, looking for anything that might have survived. Most of the contents had turned to mulch, but tucked under the pilot's seat, wedged tightly against the floor, was a dark green, military-style gearbox. It was dented and scratched, but its heavy-duty metal construction had kept it intact. He recognized it as a waterproof hard case, the kind soldiers and field researchers used. Hope, sharp and clear, cut through his sadness. He carefully worked the box free from the wreckage. The latches were stiff with corrosion, but with some effort they sprang open with a loud crack. The hardened rubber seal around the lid, though brittle with age, had done its job. He lifted the lid, and the air that escaped smelled not of decay, but of old paper and leather. Inside, nestled in what was once protective foam, lay a single object, a handsome, leather-bound journal. He lifted it out with a reverence usually reserved for ancient artifacts. The leather was stiff and darkened with moisture, but it was whole. He opened the cover. The pages were yellowed and brittle, crumbling at the corners. The ink, a dark blue, had faded and blurred in places, but it was still legible. The first page bore a name, written in a strong, confident hand: Daniel Monroe, 1978. Robert sat on a moss-covered log a short distance from the wreckage, the roar of the falls, a constant backdrop. He began to read, and as he did, the story of the lost plane and its pilot finally began to unfold. Daniel Monroe was not a pilot by trade. He was an investigative journalist from Seattle. His diary entries, eloquent and detailed, painted a picture of a man on the most dangerous assignment of his life. He had been investigating a powerful logging company, accusing them of illegal clear-cutting in protected national forests and of bribing federal officials to look the other way. The early entries were filled with frustration, close calls, and the names of sources who were too scared to talk on the record. But then he had found his proof. A disgruntled company insider had given him a set of maps detailing the illegal operations, along with a ledger of payments. He had the story. He just had to get it out. The final entries, written in the days leading up to the crash, were chilling. Monroe was convinced he was being followed. He wrote of strange cars parked outside his apartment, of clicks on his phone line. He knew that flying out of Seattle with a commercial airline was too risky. So he had chartered a small private plane, a Cessna, from a small airfield in a neighboring county. The last entry, written on a date 40 years ago, laid the conspiracy bare. To throw them off, Monroe had written, "I have filed a false flight plan heading east, towards Idaho. My real destination is south, to a colleague in Oregon who I trust to publish this. I suspect they may have tampered with the plane. I checked it myself, but I'm a journalist, not a mechanic. I pray I am just being paranoid." He had added a final haunting paragraph. "The ELT, the emergency transmitter, seems to be malfunctioning. The mechanic said it was a faulty switch, but I have a bad feeling. If the worst happens, if I don't make it, I hope someone finds this. The truth has to come out." The date is the 12th of October, 1978. A historic storm is predicted for this afternoon. May it be the wind at my back. Robert closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. It all made sense now. The false flight plan meant no one was looking in the right state, let alone the right forest. The sabotaged transmitter meant the plane sent out no distress signal. And the historic storm, the very one Robert remembered his father talking about, would have erased any immediate signs of a crash, making a search impossible. Daniel Monroe hadn't just crashed. He had been deliberately silenced. Robert looked from the journal to the wreckage, then to the waterfall, the silent keeper of this 40-year-old secret. His mission, he now understood, was far from over. It had just begun. He wasn't just here to recover a body. He was here to recover the truth. As Robert closed the journal, the world seemed to shift. The roar of the waterfall was no longer just the sound of water. It was the voice of the past, a 40-year-old cry for justice. The weight of Daniel Monroe's story settled upon him, a responsibility he now shared. He carefully placed the journal back into its waterproof case and secured it in his pack. His mission was clear, but the forest had other plans. The sky, which had been a clear high blue just an hour before, had turned a bruised, menacing shade of gray. The wind began to whip through the canyon, tearing leaves from the trees and sending a cold, sharp spray from the falls across the wreckage. A low rumble of distant thunder echoed off the cliff walls. The historic storm that had sealed Daniel Monroe's fate seemed to have a modern echo, and it was bearing down on them fast. "We need to find shelter, buddy," Robert said, raising his voice over the rising wind. The flimsy tent in his pack would be shredded in minutes. His eyes fell on the only viable option, the broken fuselage of the Cessna. It was a grim choice, a tomb, but it was their only chance. He helped Buddy into the cramped rear of the cabin, then squeezed in after him just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The downpour was instantaneous and violent, a torrential sheet of water that hammered against the thin aluminum skin of the plane, creating a deafening din. The world outside the broken windscreen dissolved into a gray, watery blur. Inside the wreckage, it was dark and claustrophobic. Robert and Buddy huddled together, the smell of rust and damp earth thick in the air. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Robert saw a flicker of movement near the front of the cabin. He froze. A figure was emerging from the deep shadows of the cockpit, unfolding itself like a ghost. It was a man, old and gaunt, his frame little more than skin and bone beneath layers of ragged, mismatched clothing. A long, matted gray beard and wild, unkempt hair framed a face so deeply lined and weathered it looked like a piece of ancient wood. But it was his eyes that held Robert captive. They were pale, haunted things, burning with a mixture of fear and a fierce, cornered animal defensiveness. The man held a large, rusty hunting knife in one trembling hand. It was the man who had set the traps, the silent inhabitant of the forest. Buddy let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating through the small space. He moved to place himself between Robert and the stranger, his body a rigid wall of protective muscle. "Easy, boy," Robert commanded softly, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He put a firm hand on Buddy's back, a signal to hold his ground but not to attack. With his other hand, he slowly raised it, palm open and empty, showing he was not a threat. The shotgun remained slung on his shoulder, a clear statement that he was capable of defense, but his open hand showed he had no intention of aggression. The old man's eyes darted from Robert's face, to his open hand, to the shotgun, and then to Buddy. Finally, his gaze fell on the open gearbox on the floor. "You found it," he rasped, his voice a dry, scratchy whisper, as if he hadn't used it for years. You found his words. The tension was thick enough to cut with the man's rusty knife. Outside, the storm raged, a perfect mirror for the turmoil inside the cramped fuselage. "Daniel Monroe," Robert said, the name a key turning in a 40-year-old lock. "I'm here because of him." The old man flinched as if struck. His shoulders sagged, the fight seeming to drain out of him, the knife in his hand lowered. He sank onto the battered co-pilot seat, his face collapsing into a mask of utter despair. "Daniel Monroe," he repeated, the name a prayer and a curse. "My name is Simon," the old man whispered after a long silence, his gaze lost in the rain-streaked void beyond the windscreen. "And I am the reason he is here." The confession, when it came, was a torrent, a flood of guilt and memory held back for 4 decades. Simon wasn't a guardian of the wreckage, he was its prisoner. He had not been a hunter then, but a young aircraft mechanic, barely 20 years old, working at the small airfield Monroe had used. He was good at his job but in debt, and the logging company had found his weakness. They didn't give him a choice. They threatened him, his family. All he had to do, they said, was tamper with the emergency transmitter and drain a bit of fuel, just enough to make the plane go down in the remote wilderness where no one would ever find it. "I was a kid," Simon choked out, tears carving clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "I was scared. I told myself it would be okay, that he would just have to hike out. But then, the storm came. That terrible storm. I knew I had sent him to his death. The guilt had consumed him. He quit his job, left his family, and vanished, retreating into the very forest that held his crime. He had built a life here, a hermit's existence, as a way to serve his sentence. The strange symbols were his warnings, the traps his brutal, last-resort security, to keep anyone from ever discovering the wreckage, from ever digging up the sin that had defined his entire life. Robert listened, his own heart aching with a familiar sorrow. He looked at this broken man, a man haunted by a single catastrophic failure, and he saw a reflection of himself. The face of the young climber on Mount Rainier flashed in his mind. He knew this man's prison. He had lived in a version of it for 10 years. The storm outside began to ease, its fury spent. The hammering rain softened to a steady drumming. A sliver of watery light broke through the clouds. Robert reached into his pack and took out the journal. He offered it to Simon. The old man looked at it, his hand trembling too much to take it. He knew, Robert said gently. He wrote that he suspected the plane was tampered with. He knew the blame wasn't just on one person. It was a small lie, a slight twisting of Monroe's words, but it was an act of mercy. A lifetime of guilt had been punishment enough. For the first time in 40 years, Simon looked at another human being without fear, and in Robert's eyes, he found not judgment, but a deep and profound understanding. The unburdening had begun. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the forest washed clean and glistening under a sliver of watery sunlight. Inside the wrecked Cessna, the oppressive darkness had been replaced by a soft gray light. The air was no longer thick with tension, but with a fragile, tentative peace. Simon, who had been a creature of shadows and fear just hours before, now seemed like a different man. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a weary but clear resolve. The 40-year burden he had carried alone had finally been shared, and in that sharing, its crushing weight had been lessened. "I will go with you," Simon said, his voice no longer a dry rasp, but quiet and firm. "I will tell them everything I know. It's the least I can do for him." Robert looked at the old man, seeing not the hermit who had set traps, but the terrified 20-year-old boy who had been trapped himself. He nodded. "We'll go together." The journey back was a different experience from the journey in. It became Robert's final rescue mission. Simon knew this forest better than any map, guiding them along paths that were almost invisible. Though his gaunt frame was surprisingly resilient after 40 years of hardship, the trek was still a grueling trial for his aging body. Robert had to use his skills not just for himself, but for Simon, setting up ropes for steep descents and carefully helping him across treacherous terrain. Buddy seemed to understand the shift in dynamics. The dog, who had been a rigid wall of defense against Simon, now acted as a gentle bridge between the two men. He would walk between them, his presence a calm, non-judgmental reassurance. Occasionally, he would nudge Simon's hand with his wet nose, and the old man, after some hesitation, would rest a trembling hand on the dog's head, a flicker of a smile touching his lips for the first time in decades. When they finally emerged from the forest days later, the modern world was a shock to Simon's system. The sight of cars, the noise, the sheer number of people sent him reeling. Robert acted as his steady guide, shielding him from the overwhelming stimuli, guiding him to his truck with a protective hand on his shoulder. Their first stop was not the sheriff's office, but the office of a small-town lawyer Robert knew he could trust. From there, the story of Daniel Monroe, supported by his journal and the sworn testimony of a man named Simon, was carefully given to a state prosecutor and a veteran reporter from a major Seattle newspaper. The story, when it broke, was not a ripple. It was a shockwave. The tale of the lost journalist, the 40-year-old conspiracy, and the hermit who held the key to it all captivated the public. An official investigation was launched. The logging company, though under new ownership, could not escape the crimes of its past. Faced with overwhelming evidence and public outrage, they were held accountable, forced to pay massive fines, and fund a large-scale reforestation project in the very areas they had illegally clear-cut. A formal recovery mission, guided by Robert, returned to the Silent Falls. The remains of Daniel Monroe were brought out of the wilderness with the dignity and honor he had long been denied. A memorial service was held, attended by reporters, environmental activists, and distant relatives of Monroe who had never known what had become of him. He was no longer a forgotten man, but a hero who had died for the truth. Through all of this, Robert was a quiet, steady presence. He watched as Simon, now clean-shaven and dressed in new clothes, bravely faced the cameras and the courts, his testimony the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. He saw the relief on the faces of Monroe's family. He had completed his mission. He had brought someone home. One cool autumn evening, weeks later, Robert was sitting on the porch of his cabin. The air was crisp, the leaves were turning shades of gold and crimson, and the setting sun painted the peaks of the Cascades in hues of orange and purple. Buddy lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, content. The nightmares had not vanished entirely, but they had changed. The image of the young climber falling from Mount Rainier was still there, a scar on his soul, but it no longer had the power to break him. It was a memory of a tragedy, not a verdict on his life. He had failed that day, but he had not failed Daniel Monroe. And in seeing Simon's path to redemption, he had realized that one failure did not have to be a life sentence. He felt a sense of peace he had not known in a decade. The cabin was no longer a prison or a fortress. It was a home, and it was about to become something more. On the small table beside him was a piece of paper and a pen. He picked it up and began to write. He was outlining a proposal, a plan to start a new, volunteer-based search and rescue training program for young people in the surrounding counties. He would use his skills, his experience, not to hide from the world, but to serve it once more. He would teach them how to navigate the wilderness, how to save lives, and most importantly, how to support their partners when the mission was over. He looked out at the vast, beautiful wilderness that had almost broken him. It had been the scene of his greatest failure and the stage for his redemption. He had walked into it to find a dead man's story and had, in the process, finally found his own way back to the living. In the quiet loyalty of a loving animal, we often find the strength to face our own past. The story of Robert and Buddy reminds us that the path to healing is never walked alone, and that true purpose can be found in the missions we least expect. If these stories of courage and companionship mean something to you, you are a welcome part of our community. You can support us by sharing your thoughts in a comment and by subscribing so that more of these tales can be told. Our next journey is ready to begin. Just click the video that has appeared on your screen.